Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk, oh my hair is not great, I did wake up from a nap just now. Today we are going to talk about the goddess. And I'm going to start out by making a sweeping generalization, which of course is going to miss out on a lot of nuance. Don't come for me in the comments. But I think that broadly speaking, when we talk about the goddess with a capital T and a capital G, right? Um, One of the things that's very important to how the goddess is understood is that she is a goddess of nature. She is present in nature. And I think that broadly speaking, there are two main ways that people find the goddess in nature. There are people who think of her as a moon goddess, and there are people who think of her as an earth goddess. Now, of course, she is both of those things at once. We'll get into that. And there are other ways that the goddess is found in nature, depending on how you personally connect with her. One of my seekers really strongly connects her with the stars and kind of the expanse of the galaxy. I know people who oh, good grief, I have notifications going off. I didn't put myself in do not disturb mode. Let's try this again. I know people who identify very strongly with the Dion Fortune perspective and consider the goddess a sea goddess. I know at least one initiate who has this very kind of cosmic view of her as being in the rings of Saturn and so on. So lots and lots of different ways that people identify the goddess with features of nature. But I think broadly speaking, we have two really big camps, which are moon goddess and earth goddess. Right? It's uncommon for people to talk about her as a rain goddess or a sun goddess or a snow goddess. There are certain features of the natural world that we are more likely to associate with her than others. And the goddess, certainly as she appears in Wicca and as she appears kind of in the broader goddess worshipping community, has both of those features, right? She is both things at once. And I don't think there's a lot of tension there. But it's interesting to me that those two things should be so closely aligned in the modern imagination in the way that contemporary goddess worshippers think about her, when there's nothing inherent about the moon and the earth that says, yeah, like a Mother Earth goddess and a moon goddess are going to be one and the same. That's a really interesting conflation to me. And I also think it's interesting because a lot of the time you will see, just in the language that people use when they're talking about their own relationship with the goddess, or in kind of the way that people shape the rituals that they write and so on, you'll see people privileging one interpretation over the other. And that's not to say that they're choosing one at the expense of the other. They're not necessarily denying that she can be the other thing, but usually people find one of those two things that feels more comfortable for them as a way of relating to the goddess. So, moon goddess, earth goddess, where do those things come from and why do they come together? And the answer is complicated, as these things tend to be. It's true that the conflation does arise very early on. So for anyone who has read Queen of All Witcheries, which, by the way, there is a second edition of Queen of All Witcheries that's coming out from Crossed Crow. I don't have a publication date on that yet, but we're in the works. I've been sent some kind of rough sketches of what the cover for the second edition is going to look like. I'm very excited about that. So it's coming. I promise it's coming, and it's going to have a whole bunch of new information, which I'm really excited about. Just a quick plug for that. But anyone who has read Queen of All Witcheries, right in chapter 1, I talk about Johann Jakob Bachhofen, and I talk about the way that he identified goddess worship with both the earth and the moon. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. All right, I can't find it, but Bachhofen identifies the goddess with Mother Earth. He identifies her with the principle of motherhood, and then, right, the kind of motif of Mother Earth that you find in many cultures, but especially in the ancient Mediterranean, which was Bachhofen's primary focus archaeologically. And then he also is contrasting this imagined prehistoric matriarchal goddess religion with contemporary patriarchal Christianity, which tends to have very solar symbolism because of the idea of eternal life. So the promise of eternal life, according to Bachofen, is this very patriarchal idea that aligns with the imagery of the sun, because the sun never goes out. And Bachofen deliberately contrasts that with the imagery of the moon, which is more cyclical and maybe has more of a focus on like his idea, right? He thought that lunar religion would, rather than prioritizing the idea of an eternal resurrection after death, would focus on ideas of kind of constant rebirth, ancestor veneration, and a deeper interrelationship between the living and the dead. And so as he's trying to contrast ancient matriarchal religion with modern patriarchal religion, he starts with this idea that the goddess is the mother and that she is Mother Earth, and then he adds onto that the lunar imagery in order to create this contrast with the kind of eternal, perennial, like immortality imagery that we get in patriarchal Christianity. So we have this idea, this conflation of the Earth Mother and the Moon Goddess from like day one with modern goddess worship, right? It always comes back to Bachofen in one way or another. But I don't think that's the entirety of the story here. I think there are two parallel streams of the development of goddess worship that are working along very different sorts of lines that end up converging as these things start to come together in the 20th century. So on the one hand, we have the lunar stuff. And the lunar imagery of the goddess, I think, really can be attributed, Ronald Hutton would be proud of me, can really be attributed to the Romantic artistic movement, including Romantic poetry, which prioritized the goddess Diana really above all other goddesses in the classical world. Like, Romantic poets loved Diana, and they loved the imagery of Diana as this like chaste goddess of the moon. And then, right, Romantic poets were often men, and there's this weird thing that happens where the virgin, chaste goddess of the moon who has no interest in sexuality gets very sexualized by a lot of these poetic figures, as well as by painters. Whole other interesting conversation to have. But this idea of Diana as A, a lunar goddess, but then B, kind of the goddess of the pagans, the goddess who represented a pastoral, pre-industrial, romanticized, idealized, nature-based way of life, becomes very, very important. Really, like, I mean, we have some of it in the 18th century, it blossoms in the 19th century, and then it comes to a head with the pagan revival, as you have people looking back toward a lot of these literary and artistic sources to inspire their own understanding of pre-industrial religion, pastoral religion, and the concept of nature in general. So because of the importance of Diana in the Romantic movement, the goddess of contemporary paganism becomes this very lunar figure. And she is a goddess of nature, she is a goddess of life, she's a goddess of yada, yada, yada. But all of it comes back to the lunar symbolism because she's drawing so heavily from Diana. And I think that really especially comes to a head with the publication of the Gospel of the Witches, right? Charles Godfrey Leland, pulling kind of from different sources, he purported to be, right, recording the actual surviving witch religion of, the Tuscan witches, which, fine, it's all well and good. There's some elements of genuine Italian folklore in there. There's some stuff that's bullshit that he made up. It's a mixed bag. But certainly, again, the prominence of the goddess Diana as the goddess of the witches and the witch cult then kind of enters the popular imagination, combines with all this other Diana stuff that's in the water at the time, and encourages people who are involved in the pagan revival to really look for Diana for inspiration when trying to understand this goddess of the witches, right? You have figures like Doreen Valiente in particular, who then, Doreen later was much less interested in Diana as a figure. She got very interested in, like, Hecate and Ceridwen were really names that came up over and over again for her. But certainly in the early days, you have this inspiration that's coming from romantic poetry and art, and then you have the Gospel of the Witches that's identifying Diana as a goddess of the witches, and telling witches to meet on the full moons, and it kind of comes together into this very lunar goddess figure, because she's taking so much inspiration from Diana. And I think that's one of the streams that develops. And the other stream that is developing really concurrently with all of this is the kind of Earth Mother fertility, agrarian kind of goddess, like the Corn Mother, the Grain Mother, etc., which, not to beat the drum that I'm always beating in everything I do, but I think we can really attribute a lot of that imagery to James Frazer and the Golden Bough. Right, so Frazer is looking for a prototype of ancient pagan religion, which he then thinks, he thinks that Christianity is just kind of a meager copy of ancient paganism. And he comes out with this idea of, in very broad terms, an earth goddess who is eternal, who is kind of the source of sovereignty and the power of the land, and then a divine god king who is married to the earth, who derives his authority and his right to rule from the earth and from the goddess, and who himself embodies the vegetation that lives and dies upon the land, including spirits of the trees, but more importantly and much more significantly, the spirit of the grain that is harvested and ground into flour and that provides kind of the source of subsistence for his people. So this real, hardcore imagery of the cycles of life and death and harvest, and, oh no, we have a divine king who is at once a man and a god, and he's gonna die, and then that's, he's gonna come back to life, and that happens to be a very seasonal thing, that he's coming to life again in the spring. And you get it. You get where it's going. The whole thing is not even a veiled, it is a direct attack on Christianity. But really, really important, really influential in the development of a lot of modern pagan thinking, and the kind of core themes that we see expressed over and over again in a lot of different forms of paganism. Not just Wicca, but especially Wicca. I've said it before, I'll say it again, the Golden Bough is a handbook of the Gardnerian tradition. Everything, if you have understood the Golden Bough, you have understood the Gardnerian tradition. That is a hill I will die on. And I think that the way that Frazer talks about the goddess in the Golden Bough, and in particular her connection with the earth and the kind of divine right to rule that comes from the goddess's connection to the earth, very, very strongly manifests in the way that people talk about the Earth Mother, Mother Gaia, all of that to this day. And it also manifests in some of the gender norms that we have in Wicca. Not the only thing that influenced those gender norms by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at the idea that shows up sometimes in certain forms of traditional Wicca, that the High Priestess is really the kind of the ground of power in the coven, and that the High Priestess is the constant, and even the High Priest is replaceable, but the High Priestess is eternal. That's language that's being taken directly from Frazer. And again, going back to Doreen Valiente, we know from her public writings that she felt that her own work, as well as Gerald Gardner's work, was very heavily influenced by the Golden Bough. Influenced by other things as well, and she provides a list of influences, including the Gospel of the Witches. But the Golden Bough, definitely one of the big hitters as far as significant influences on Wicca. And then I think from the Golden Bough, kind of the next really important thing that happens is the witch cult in Western Europe, which is a lot less lunar than people remember it as being. Margaret Murray really explicitly says that Sabbats are seasonal celebrations and Esbats can be held at any time. She says that Esbats may have been weekly meetings, but like there's no lunar Esbat in the witch cult in Western Europe. That's a thing that comes really from the Gospel of the Witches. It's not in Margaret Murray, which is fascinating because there are so many ways in which, again, Wicca in particular, very heavily based on the witch cult in Western Europe. In a lot of ways, everything that I do as a Gardnerian is Margaret Murray LARP, which is embarrassing to admit, but true. But the witch cult in Western Europe really doesn't have this lunar notion of deity that we see in the Gospel of the Witches or some other like later writings about witchcraft. And for Murray, the witch cult is just agrarian. It's just about the earth and the crops and making the crops grow. And we have the Sabbats, which are the seasonal celebrations that are all about making the crops grow. The crops and also livestock. Like livestock to a lesser extent, the witch cult that we see in Murray is really, really focused on crop growth. But it is an agrarian religion in general. And we also see that extending to livestock, especially when she talks about the embodiment of the god of the witches. She mentions that frequently the god of the witches might be represented by a livestock animal, a pig or a goat or a cow or so on. But yeah, the descriptions that we get of deity in Margaret Murray, which are themselves complicated and fraught, right? She has this idea that later gets echoed by Gerald Gardner, that the witch cult was originally a matriarchal goddess cult, and that kind of gradually over time, the horned god took over. And depending on where in the text you're looking, it seems like either she's suggesting that the goddess became the horned god, or that there was a god that maybe supplanted her in importance, and we still see the figure of the Queen of the Sabbath as kind of a divine feminine incarnation that's present even when the horned god is. It gets really murky in Margaret Murray. She also, in places, seems to suggest that the god of the witches was this kind of nebulous, genderless figure and kind of just depended on who was in charge and who was representing that figure. And sometimes it was a woman and sometimes it was a man, and just like, go figure, right? But what we see of the description of the deity of the witches, whatever it may be in Margaret Murray, is this real deep, intimate connection to the land. Margaret Murray is really obsessed with the connection between witches and their god and the land. And so again, we have this like earth goddess figure, which is problematized and complicated by the horned god, and by like everything that's going on in Margaret Murray. But we have this like horned deity figure, not really split into two divine consorts the way that we later get in Wicca, but this deity figure who might be a goddess, might be a god, and who is directly connected with the power of the land. And I think what's really interesting when we get to Wicca, and then everything explodes after Wicca, right? Like Wicca has so much influence on all of the paganism that comes later. But when we get to Wicca, you have people who are synthesizing basically every source that they can find about ancient paganism. And some of those are sources that we would now not consider reliable or, authoritative sources, but at the time, like, people were reaching for what they had access to. And they're reaching for the Golden Bough, they're reaching for the witch cult in Western Europe, they're reaching for the Gospel of the Witches, and they're bringing these things together and creating this great big glorious synthesis out of all of them, which results in a goddess who is at once a moon goddess and an earth goddess. And again, that idea that those two things go together, that doesn't originate with Wicca. We do see it much earlier with Bachofen, but I think that with Wicca, like, we're not picking that idea directly from Bachofen. It's split off and then it recombined, because the early Wiccans were drawing from multiple sources, some of which said the goddess is lunar, some of which said the goddess is terrestrial. And the result is that we get a goddess who is very much both. And it's interesting, I think, to think about the way that some people reach more readily for the lunar symbolism or for the terrestrial symbolism. The goddess is unquestionably lunar. We have a lot of lunar symbolism in Wicca, but I personally tend to connect more to her as the Earth Mother. Right? Like the lunar symbolism, it's there, it's important, it's a part of how I do ritual. Like it's all there for sure, 100%. But like I don't know, there's something about just the vastness of the earth to me that just screams goddess. And a lot of the time when I'm meditating or praying or writing an invocation or like whatever it might be, a lot of the time that's the imagery and that's the language that I'll reach for. Doesn't mean I don't reach for the lunar stuff, but like the Earth Mother is very present for me. And I know other people who scoff at the Earth Mother thing and feel like that's really not who our goddess is. That's not what she's all about. Like she is a moon goddess or she is a celestial goddess. Like they very much connect with her up in the sky, which is super cool. Totally legit, totally valid. Not the primary way that I feel her. And I mean, then I think there's a really interesting thing to think about with like, for those who want to incorporate Celtic imagery into their understanding of the goddess, which I generally, oh good grief, why has my computer gone to sleep? Hopefully I'm still recording, I am. For those who want to incorporate something Celtic into their connection with the goddess, not necessarily for me, but a lot of people do it. You can think about the three realms of the earth, the sea, and the sky. And like we have three visions of the goddess, right? We have the earth goddess, we have the sea goddess that I haven't really talked about today, but again, if you read the Dion Fortune stuff, it's certainly there, it's available, it's present. And then we have a celestial goddess in the form of kind of a moon and star goddess. So a very specific version of the sky, right? The nighttime sky, but absolutely she's still there. Something worth thinking about. But it's also interesting to me, and this is, I think, the last thought that I have before I'll wrap this video up, because I try not to ramble too long. It's interesting to me because I think that the nature imagery of the goddess has also had a lot of influence on the imagery of the god in Wicca. Right? Like, you look at very early Wicca, you look at the writings of Gerald Gardner and so on, and like, the god is described certainly as a horned god, right? Like he got them antlers going on. But he's not often described in kind of nature-y terms, like immanence in nature terms, the same way that the goddess is. The goddess is very frequently described as an earth goddess or a moon goddess, or and the god is a little more shadowy. He's a little murkier. Again, very strong connection to hunting and to deer. He is a stag god. He is a god of game and of wild animals. That, super present, for sure. And insofar as the god is found in nature, kind of, again, like there's kind of a dual thing that happens, which again connects with these two streams, right? On the one hand, you have the, like, god of the wild beasts thing, which is drawing a lot from, again, romantic poetry. Think about Pan as kind of this god of nature, god of the shepherds, and so on. And so we have the lord of the animals, very much imagery that comes through in early Wicca. And then we also have more of an agricultural lord of the crops, which, again, is drinking from the well of James Fraser. But what's very interesting is that if you look at a lot of Wicca books or sources, or just the discourse, the way that people are talking about Wicca, certainly from the 90s on, it starts earlier, but like we really see it in full force in the 90s. People are looking at the goddess and then adjusting the god's attributes to match her. So people are looking at the moon goddess and saying, well, she has a consort, he must be a sun god. People are looking at the earth goddess and saying, well, she's Mother Earth, he must be Father Sky. And so we get this vision of the god, of the horned god, as a consort to the goddess that is very much being shaped by kind of the nature imagery that we choose to associate with her, because people will want them to match.